This video is part 2 of the video series on the production of staves for segmented wood turning, using the bandsaw to cut the angled staves. In part 1 of this video series, I described the basic techniques that I developed to accurately and reproducibly cut the staves on the bandsaw using the Accu-Slice system. In this part 2 of this video series, I'll be demonstrating some additional techniques to more accurately cut the staves, and then some additional techniques to quickly and accurately glue the staves together to produce some larger stave projects. For this next project, I'll be using alternating Purple Heart and Maple. And I have boards here that are 16 inches long. And these will both all run through the board sander to get them all the exact same thickness and width. So they're perfectly identical in size. And later I'll be cutting these in half because this bowl I'm making will be 8 inches tall. Now to get my angle perfect here, again, I did something a little bit different. I got a smaller scrap piece of the same board. And I'm making a cut, and then I'll reverse it 180 degrees to see if it lines up exactly. And if it's perfectly aligned, the bandsaw blade marks should be right in line with one another. Okay, I got the small scrap of wood mounted to my fence. I'm going to make one cut, and then reverse the board 180 degrees. So the blade should go right in the same curve. That blade went right in the same curve. That assures that both of those boards will be exactly the same thickness. You know, both top and bottom. And here you can see the boards are identical. They're the top edges, same distance, and the bottom are the same dimension also. So now I'm ready to start cutting my boards. What I'm doing here is just getting rid of any fuzzies on the end of the board because I don't want to interfere with my alignment. And again, I'm using the same technique of clapping the board in the system. And using these clamps just to hold it in place while I clamp it in place with these offset clamps. Just trying to make sure that the board is perfectly parallel. And if the board is warped slightly, it'll pull it in. I had the birch board I'm cutting actually was warped a slight amount, and I'm able to pull it in with the clamps. I mean, I'm talking, just a very, very small amount, a few thousandths. So once that clamp's in place, then I can release my knife, and I'm ready to go. And here's the two resulting board, again, each perfectly the same dimension with one another. And here I just moved the camera so you can get a better view of the actual cutting of the boards. And this is the second board, the birch board. First of all, I'm putting the clamps on to clamp it tight against the sacrificial fence, tighten up my offset clamps, and then remove the bar clamps. And then I continue to cut the board in half, giving me two identical birch boards. And after that, I just continue to cut the remaining boards till all of them have been sliced. Out of those Purple Heart and birch boards, I was able to make actually 3 segmented disc. 2 of these are 8 inches tall, and 1 of these is 4 inches tall. And now I'm ready to start gluing these up. And I'm going to try something different on this one, see how it works. What I'm going to do is glue these up in sets. The 2 that are perpendicular in the center. I'll glue those up in sets of 2. My concern is after I glued it up, when I put it out together, they may not align properly because the glue may, change the dimensions. But I'll give it a try and see how it works, and if it works, then I'll do it on the remainder. So the idea is to do 2 segments at a time, gluing them up in sets of 2, and then I'll glue the 9 sets together later. I'm going to glue these such that they are in sets of 2 like this. I need to set about maybe 10 minutes before I take them apart and glue them up, because the glue should totally set in that period of time. Once again, I sped this part of the video up 5 times the actual speed, again for viewing purposes. But I am putting the Type-On 3 glue on both surfaces to be glued, and then using rubber bands to clamp them together. And eventually I'll put some small spring clamps on there to give it a little more pressure on the glued up joint. And then I continue gluing out the remaining sets of staves until all of them have been glued together. After all the pieces have been glued together, I then allow them to set for at least 15 minutes, and then I'll proceed with the final glue up of the segments. I had one slip on me, slip about 1/16 of an inch, but luckily I had enough material left that I was able to make another one to fill in, so that's saved there. So now I'm ready to glue these up. It should go a little bit easier now that these 2 aren't going to move, so let's start gluing them up. And I then apply the Type-On glue to both surfaces of all the sets of segments. After applying glue to all sides of the segment sets, I then will clamp them together using rubber bands. And again, I like using rubber bands because they give a nice even pressure around the entire circumference of the pieces being glued. And then I even double up on the rubber bands at times to give them additional pressure to pull them in tight. But this technique actually worked quite well. The hole in the center is very, very symmetrical and round, and the pieces lined up much better than the previous technique. So I'll be using this technique going forward. So it came out pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and glue this other one up the same way, gluing it up in sets too. And once again, I apply glue to both surfaces to be glued together, and then I'll be clamping together using some spring clamps. And then I changed my technique once again a little bit. I started using some parallel clamps to make sure the pieces stay perfectly straight from the top to the bottom. And I did this because previously, in the previous set, I did lose one piece because it actually slipped. The clamps caused a little bit of pressure and caused it to slip. But by putting those parallel clamps on just for a few seconds till the glue sets, it holds them perfectly straight and parallel to one another. And then I continue to glue up the remaining sets of staves. Okay, and all the sets are all glued up. Now I'll start gluing them all together. Just a note, I did no sanding on these surfaces. This is just as it came off the bandsaw. This was cut with an 8/10 per inch blade. Very minor bandsaw blade marks. In the future, I'll probably switch to a 10/10 per inch blade, which will give you a smoother cut. And once again, I apply the Type-On 3 glue to both surfaces to be glued together. gluing all the segments and assembling them into the round disc. And then I'll be using the rubber bands once again to clamp everything in position. Using lots of rubber bands so I get lots of good pressure on it. Again, this technique works much better by pre-gluing the sets of staves. The final assembly was more symmetrical, and that hole in the center was near perfect. Okay, here are my 3 pieces ready for production. This is right after glue up. I haven't cleaned this up yet. The glue joints are still apparent on it. Then I took this and I put it in the lathe, cleaned up the surfaces, both horizontal and vertical surfaces. That's what it looks like. And again, I got nice, clean joints on all those. You can see the joints in that are nice and tight. And this technique of gluing 2 sets at a time, I got a perfect center circle. So that was a great technique to glue these up. It went much faster, and it's definitely more accurate. And that's the same on both sides. And I said this is the one ready for glue up now. I put a segmented Purple Heart piece with an accent ring, both top and bottom. So the top and bottom will be the same on this. But that's ready to turn now on the lathe. I'm now gluing the 4-inch segmented stave piece to a base, and this is the base that I developed in a previous video on making base rings for segmented bowls. And after clapping that and put a little bit of pressure on it, let that set for at least an hour, and then I'll proceed to the next step. I then glue on the top piece in the same manner. Again, I'm using my rotating tailstock to make sure I get perfect alignment of the pieces as I glue them together. So now I'm ready to start turning this small stave project into a small vase. And again, I've sped this up and I'm editing it pretty heavily, again for viewing purposes. And but a couple issues. Number one, I used a rotating tailstock to keep the piece centered. One of my concerns was the glue joint of gluing end grain to surface grain. And I was concerned that joint might be very weak, especially the end grain glue joint might be quite weak. So as a result, I'm cutting very carefully and trying to minimize vibration. And by putting that rotating tailstock in there, even though it's a short piece, it does help reduce vibration and give me smoother cuts. So after finished profiling my piece, I then did sand it, starting with 100 grit sandpaper and going down to 400 grit sandpaper to fully finish the outside dimensions and surface. So I'm now ready to turn the inside of my segmented stave bowl. And one of my main concerns is the weakness of that bottom joint where I have an end grain glue joint. And as a result, any vibration, that joint could break away pretty easily. So I did attach my Carter Lathe multi-rest work support system. This consists of roller bearings that ride on my bowl, and it just helps it run more smoothly and reduces vibration. I did pre-drill a hole. I used a Forstner bit which is about 2.5 inches in diameter, and drilled down all the way to the bottom, and that just reduced the amount of cutting I needed to do with the lathe tools, and again help reduce vibration for getting the major portion of that center hole drilled through. I then finished the inside, starting with 100 grit sandpaper and going all the way down to 400 grit sandpaper, and then finishing off with steel wool. And this is a finished stave bowl on a lathe, which I proceeded to cut off using a parting tool. The first step after gluing the staves together into the round cylinder was to round these staves and to clean up the ends. So this is done on the lathe, first of all by turning down one side and then reversing it in the chuck and then turning down the reverse side. And again, I use my rotating tailstock to keep everything nice and square and centered as I was doing this cleaning up. And here's the finished block after it's been cleaned up on the lathe. For the next step, I want to turn the inside diameter larger using a Forstner bit. So I put it back on the lathe inside the chuck, clamped it in position. I use the rotating tailstock to accurately center the position and then tighten up the chuck. Then I put my 2-inch Forstner bit in my tailstock and proceeded to drill a hole all the way down to the bottom. Notice that once again I'm using the Carter lathe multi-rest work support system for increased stability while drilling the hole to the center. And this is the finished stave block after drilling the 2-inch hole through the center. Next, I'll be adding one of the segmented stave bases that I designed in a previous video to my segmented stave block. Again, gluing the piece together using my rotating tailstock with the chuck on the base. And then first of all gluing the base to the segmented stave block. And then after allowing that to dry for at least 15 minutes, I glued on the top pieces to the stave block. After allowing the glued up assembly to dry for at least 4 hours, I then proceeded to turn the larger segmented stave project. I was designing this base freehand as I was going along with a larger top for the vase, a smaller base, and then a center section going tapered down. So a different design, so we'll see how it works out, but wasn't sure exactly what I want to do as I was designing this. And then after the turning was complete, I sanded this vase, starting with 100 grit sandpaper and going all the way down to 400 grit, and then finishing off with steel wool. Once again, I used the Carter lathe multi-rest work support system for this vase because it's fairly long and large and somewhat heavy, and especially with the end grain glue at the bottom, I was really concerned about the vibration that might cause it to break loose because that's a fairly weak joint. So I use a variety of tools to taper it down, taper the top base, and then also turn the inside. Again, being very careful as I was cutting to not put too much stress on that bottom joint and get a smooth finish on the inside. After the outside and inside turnings were complete for both of the segmented stave vases described in this video, I cut them off the base plate on the lathe using a small parting tool. I then sanded the bases flush and flat on my 12-inch disc sander and gave each of the vases a couple of coats of bush oil. Here are the two 18-segment stave vases produced for this video. The final picture is a shot of the inside of the smaller vase, showing the segmented base pattern that was developed for a previous video series. The following are some additional details on producing segmented staves on the bandsaw. First of all, it's important that all your boards must be straight and not warped, and are the same thickness and the same width. This can most easily be accomplished with a board sander. However, a board planer could also be used. Next, it is important that the board to be cut on the Accu-Slice sacrificial fence must be both tight against the sacrificial fence and also tight against the cleat on the bottom of the sacrificial fence. I have found that one way to do this is to use a small bar clamp to hold the board against the fence. At the same time, use the offset clamp to clamp the board tight against the cleat on the bottom of the sacrificial fence. After they've been clamped with the offset clamps, the bar clamp is removed. Double check that the board is tight against the fence and cleat. If not, repeat this procedure. It is important that you slice the board in the center to produce two identical angular boards. I have found that the best way to accomplish this is to first estimate the center position and then cut 1/8 inch deep into the front surface of a scrap piece of wood of the same dimensions as the board you will be cutting. Then remove the board from the fence, rotate it 180 degrees, and repeat the 1/8 inch deep cut. If the bandsaw blade cuts in the exact same kerf as the first cut, then your two boards will be identical in dimensions. If not, readjust and repeat this procedure until they are identical. It will be necessary to run several test cuts of small pieces of wood to verify that your angles of the wedges will produce a perfect segmented disc with no gaps. For this video series, I wanted 18 segment discs. Therefore, I wanted 20.0 degree angles on my wedges. To accomplish this, I set my bandsaw table angle to 70 degrees between the bandsaw table and the bandsaw blade. After cutting 18 segments, I formed the 18 wedges into a disc. I checked that I had a small gap between several of the wedges, which resulted in an imperfect segmented disc. I ended up increasing the bandsaw table angle to 70.15 degrees in order to produce the perfect stave wedges for these videos. Use a small digital compass to measure this angle between the bandsaw blade and the bandsaw table. It may take several attempts before the bandsaw blade table angle is accurate, but then you can produce many segmented stave discs of all different board sizes and lengths. The last improvement I made for this video was to glue up sets of 2 wedges, 2 at a time. I glued the 2 surfaces that formed a right triangle on each of the segments. I used care and some additional parallel clamps to make sure the 2 wedges were glued accurately. After all the sets have been glued up, these sets were then glued together to form the completed segmented stave ring. This change made a major improvement in the accuracy of gluing the segmented staves. The segmented staves formed a near perfect circular pattern in the center of the segmented disc. I have found that rubber bands are the best method of clamping the segmented staves together to produce accurate and round segmented discs. Once again, thank you for watching this video. If you have any other questions, concerns, or comments, as always, please give us a call or drop us an email. And thank you for watching.